We're going to continue on with our next story focused on the Summit of the Future, which is taking place in New York City, September 21st to the 23rd, just 60 days away, and still way too many people are painfully unaware of this event and the potential for the United Nations to declare a planetary emergency, not to mention take some major steps to creating either a new organization, an international global governance organization, or to modifying the UN Charter to make it even stronger so they can push us closer to world government. Many people have been aware for months and made a big stink in the last year or so about the World Health Organization pandemic treaty, pandemic agreement, and people went to Geneva to protest, to rally, but there is very little noise being made at all about the Summit of the Future, if anybody knows. So I'm doing my part to kind of trumpet this issue, and I encourage you guys to share this with your friends and family so that more people are aware of this. Now, if you go to go to theconsciousresistance.com and you search Summit of the Future, you're going to find this article that I published back in April, which got a lot of traction, was translated to Spanish, and I'm very proud of it. If you want to get a primer, then you can go back and check that out. Today is based on my new article that's going to actually be published in the morning. It's not even published at The Last American Vagabond yet, so you're getting a sneak peek. Of course, if you're watching this or listening to this later, it's already at thelast.americanvagabond.com. But I wrote this article back in April titled "The Summit of the Future and the Pact for the Future Will Rapidly Expand the Technocratic Takeover." And if you don't know the term technocracy, you're not familiar with it, again, go to the website, search technocracy. Go to theconsciousresistance.com/how-to and download my book, How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State, which gives you a history and background on the technocracy movement and also how it relates to our current world and what's coming soon. Let's look at the new article, though. And since it's not published, you're looking at the back end of the TLEV website. So I'm just going to show you guys this. Sorry, it's ugly, but I need to be able to read what I wrote today because it's pretty fresh. I titled it, "The UN Will Sign the Pact of the Future in 60 Days. Here's why it mattered." And I'm just going to hit a few different key points and update you guys. This article, like I said, will be out tomorrow. In September, the United Nations 79th General Assembly will host the highly anticipated Summit of the Future, where nations are expected to sign the Pact of the Future, which represents a major step towards the creation of a one world government. And I know that's some crazy right-wing paranoia. Nobody's trying to work on a one world government, they tell us. But there sure do seem to be a lot of people talking about it while you're not paying attention. So the UN's meeting in New York City for their 79th General Assembly. This is an annual assembly. And as part of that, they're having this Summit of the Future. And again, they're going to sign something called the Pact for the Future. And they're also expected to declare a planetary emergency. This is all coming on discussions over the last few years, since at least 2022. You can go back to 2020 and find some of it as well, from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who said that it is time to shift financial resources to rapidly complete the Agenda 2030 goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, which were set by the United Nations in 2015. In September 2021, the Secretary General released his report titled Our Common Agenda, which called for the acceleration of the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and the commitments contained in the United Nations 75th Declaration. Our Common Agenda also called for a Summit of the Future so they could, quote, forge a new global consensus on readying ourselves for a future that is rife with risks, but also opportunities. And they said that the Pact of the Future will be, quote, a world and international system that is better prepared to manage the challenges we face. Now, you're going to see that, like usual, these technocrats, they want to keep us all in fear. And we've got, this term we've been hearing for multiple years now from the World Economic Forum, what they call a polycrisis. We're facing a polycrisis of rising climate disasters, economic turmoil, wars, pandemics, disease, things like that. And it's just getting so crazy that we can't have individual nation states deciding on how to respond and what steps to take. We need to have a multilateral global governance system, which is just another way to say world government. Instead of unilateral, one country acting, no, we need this multilateral system, which, hey, let's be honest, maybe that would be a good thing for us if we didn't have psychopaths running the world and managing the individual nation states or being puppets for the people who really manage the nation states. If that wasn't our reality, then sure, the idea of some peaceful global governance situation where we could, take humanity into the future and build a better planet like we all know is possible, that would be great. But you're not going to take the United States, China, Russia, and some of these authoritarian nations, which are increasingly authoritarian, throw them all into a blender and get out peaceful world government. I'm sorry, it's not going to work that way, my friends. That is not what's in the cards for us, at least not through the United Nations. This is likely to be another shift towards a world governed by unelected internationalist politicians. And as I said, the UN member states are likely to vote on radically altering the UN itself, what they're calling UN 2.0, and to change the very way that nation states make decisions about the planet. They've also recently announced that they have something called the Global Digital Compact, which they say is all about establishing an inclusive internet for multi-stakeholders. And they promise it's going to be open, free, secure, and human-centered. And it's going to help complete the Sustainable Development Goals. They've also talked about having an agreement for the future generations. They're making big moves. They're making big plans. And so while many of us are sitting there arguing on Twitter and debating on the internet or just trying to live our peaceful lives, because, the reality is most human beings are peaceful people who don't want to oppress other people. We just happen to have these psychopaths at the top, and then other well-intentioned people who do work in the UN and various nonprofits who think they're doing good work, who are being manipulated to further agendas which are not going to lead humanity to a life of liberty, privacy, individual happiness, community happiness, collective liberation. No, it's going to be more control under the philosophy of the technocrats. So as I say here, although that the Summit of the Future and the Pact of Future have begun to creep into the independent media space a little bit, the public at large is still completely unaware of this meeting and the implications of the agreements being discussed. Now, in this section, I wanted to point out one of the people who is talking about the Summit of the Future, and that is a man named Jeffrey Sachs, which you may be familiar with. Jeffrey Sachs was one of these guys who seemed to gain some support in the independent alternative community, research community during COVID 1984, because he was the chair of the Lancet, the medical journal, the Lancet's COVID-19 Commission between 2020 and 2022. And he used his position to question the source of the COVID-19 panic. He also testified in front of the US Congress in 2023 regarding the funding of gain-of-function research and the so-called lab leak theory. And he's also been interviewed on alternative media or mainstream alternative media, depending on your view, including Jimmy Dore and Russell Brand. This is, again, Jeffrey Sachs, who is quite academic, and he recently published an op-ed on the Summit of the Future. He's also been a longtime proponent of the United Nations and their Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, he is director for the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. And astute students out there will recognize the name Columbia University and will remember that Columbia University is actually the home of the original technocracy movement back in the 1930s. So is it a big surprise to see some professors at Columbia University promoting a technocratic vision of the world that we need to manage the planet for the good of everybody? That is basically the mindset of the technocrats from back in the day, that the people are too stupid to vote to know what's good for us. So we need to have a scientific dictatorship run by the scientific elite and the technological elite, micromanaging what they called the technate. That is what technocracy is about. Sachs is also the president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and he served as a special advisor to the UN Secretary General from 2001 to 2018, and also advised the previous UN Secretary General. So he's been quite involved in the UN in many different ways. So it's really no surprise that on June 21st, he wrote this piece calling for the Summit of the Future to essentially build a world government system. Of course, the word he uses is multilateralism, but again, the end goal is the same. It's the end of nation states, and it's the implementation of a world governing body with the power to affect national policies. And Jeffrey Sachs wrote, "The world's geopolitical system is not delivering what we want or need. Sustainable development is our declared goal, meaning economic prosperity, social justice, environmental sustainability, and peace. Yet our reality is continued poverty amidst plenty, widening inequalities, deepening environmental crises, and war." Sachs continued by claiming that the Summit of Future is focused on tackling a, quote, set of unprecedented challenges that can only be solved through global cooperation. And according to Sachs and the technocrats, again, the poly crisis, or multiple simultaneous crises happening at one time, cannot be solved by one country alone. In fact, he makes it perfectly clear that from his position within the UN and just as a mouthpiece for this viewpoint, he's advocating for the UN to get more power to implement policies for the entire world. He says, quote, "On the goal of reforming the UN, the key is to give more power to UN institutions and to make them more representative," or at least he alleges. And maybe he really believes that you can make the UN more representative, but I don't know about you guys, but to me, taking it from being, I have a local government that I have to deal with on a city level, I have a state government I have to deal with the state level, and then you got this federal government, and we all know the federal government is corrupt, but you're telling me that if there's an international body making decisions over my life that's based in Switzerland or something like that, somehow that's going to be more representative. Okay. Sachs also echoes previous calls for new financial instruments to fund this transformation of the world, including what he said would be a new system of international taxes on CO2 emissions, shipping, aviation, and financial transactions. So he's calling for lots of people to be taxed. Now, he might think it's just going to be the corporations and the big, the environmental polluters or whatever. But as we know, at the end of the day, these programs are the Green Agenda, Agenda 2030, is very much focused on us as individuals, on our habits, on our lives, and making it like we're the problem. Where have we heard that humanity is the problem? It's almost like this is a eugenicist agenda designed to reduce the population. Hold that thought. We'll get back to it in a moment. The goal of this goal of reforming the international system to fund the SDGs is actually, here, let me correct. I got a little typo here. This goal is actually of reforming the international financial system is actually similar to previous calls that I've reported on, including by the French government and by Gutierrez, who called for a new Bretton Woods moment, which Bretton Woods is the infamous 1944 international agreement that established the International Monetary Fund. And this is, of course, also the meeting where they adopted rules for governing monetary relations using the US dollar. So it's a major moment for the US and for the world system. They're saying we need a new Bretton Woods moment. There's also a UN document on the Summit of the Future titled, "What Would It Deliver?" which calls for a, quote, global financial system that works for all. And it says, a transformed international financial architecture is fit for purpose, more inclusive, just, representative, effective, and resilient, responsible to the world today rather than as it looked following the Second World War. The architecture invests upfront in SDGs, climate action, and future generations. And this also, again, as I said, mirrors calls that were made in 2023 when there was a meeting that most of you never heard of called the Summit for a New Global Financing Pact, which took place in Paris, France, and it was led by French President Emmanuel Macron, and had 50 heads of state, including Joe Biden was there, German Chancellor, British Prime Minister, former British Prime Minister, Brazilian President, including representatives from the Open Society Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. And this whole thing, this Summit for a New Global Financing Pact, is also, again, about resetting the international financial system as part of the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, besides Jeffrey Sachs talking about this, I also think that one of the main advocates, at least in the United States, there are other organizations internationally that are promoting the Summit of the Future. This one is called the Stimson Center. You might not have heard about them, but the more I learned about them, the more interested I become. They describe themselves as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization focused on analyzing issues relating to international peace. They focus on nuclear proliferation, water management, responses to humanitarian crises, including the claimed climate crisis. And they also advise the U.S. and international institutions. So they're not just a random think tank. They're actually advising governments. And when you start researching the Summit of the Future and the UN more generally, you're going to see the name, the Stimson Center, popped up. And they were founded in 1989 by an American, and they're named after an American lawyer and politician, Henry L. Stimson. He served as Secretary of War. Yes, there used to be a Secretary of War before they realized maybe we shouldn't tell people that we want to launch wars. We'll call it Secretary of Defense, the Defense Secretary. He served as Secretary of War under U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1940, Secretary of War under President Taft, and Secretary of State under President Hoover. So was very much involved with government. And according to the National Park Service, Stimson, again, this is Henry L. Stimson, the politician, had, quote, direct control of the Manhattan Project, which was, of course, the U.S. government's covert effort to develop nuclear weapons. And I found that the Rockefeller Foundation and the Gates Foundation have both donated, given grants to the Stimson Center. The Rockefeller Foundation more recently, since 2020, the Gates Foundation all the way back in 2008. Not saying it's directly involved with their current agenda, but it's not that surprising because both the Rockefeller Foundation and the Gates Foundation are all about Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's not surprising that they're donating to this organization. And the Stimson Center has been a consistent promoter of the Summit of the Future. They've been publishing opinion pieces, hosting virtual conferences, including just last week, they held an event called U.S. Perspectives and Priorities for the UN Summit of the Future. And this gets to a little bit more of the meat of the situation, my friends. At that event held by the Stimson Center, it was an in-person and virtual event, they had Michelle Sisson, who's the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs and a longtime diplomat with the UN, as well as another doctor who was the former Assistant Secretary of State holding that same position. And during this discussion, Michelle Sisson, who is again a U.S. government agent, U.S. UN diplomat, emphasized that the U.S. government's support for the Summit of the Future and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. She said, quote, "We also support the draft Pact of the Future's recognition of the importance of UN efforts towards developing protocols for an emergency platform in the event of further complex global shocks." Now, this is what is so important about the Summit of the Future, my friends. This call for an emergency platform and the declaration of a planetary emergency. I think this is probably the most potentially dangerous aspect of the Summit of the Future and the so-called Pact of the Future. Now, I previously reported that there was a zero draft version of this document, the Pact of the Future, was released back in, I think, February, maybe March. And in that document, the United Nations is calling for an emergency platform that they say will be activated in the event of, quote, "such a shock that it has an impact on multiple regions of the world, and according to the UN, requires a, quote, coherent, coordinated, and multidimensional response." And this draft document of the Pact for the Future also says that the emergency platform, they promise it's not going to be a standing institution or a body, and they promise that it'll fully respect the sovereignty and the territorial integrity and the political independence of the states. Trust the UN if you want. However, they're not the only ones calling for this. You have groups like the Climate Governance Commission, which are also promoting this planetary emergency. And here's a few interesting facts on the Climate Governance Commission. It was convened originally by a woman named Maha Graf, who's a member of the Global Governance Forum, which has extensive connections to technocracy, to the technocratic state, including the Rockefeller Foundation. And the Rockefeller Foundation helped fund the work of the Climate Governance Commission. I'm like updating my article here in real time. Excuse me. I'm like noticing I left out some words. Oh gosh. The Climate Governance Commission was funded by the Rockefellers, and this makes perfect sense if you recall my reporting from 2023 when I wrote that the Rockefeller Foundation has made it clear that the climate agenda is their new focus. And of course, the Stimson Center is also a close collaborator with the Climate Governance Commission. So I need to map this out, but you've got the UN, you've got groups like the Climate Governance Commission, you got the Stimson Center, you got the Rockefeller Foundation, and each of them are kind of like in this feedback loop, feeding information, then publishing pieces, getting it out there, getting politicians to pay attention. So this is my piece back in 2023. Rockefeller Foundation's new focus on climate change signals the next phase of the Great Reset. And that is what I think we're seeing here. So in November 2023, right before the UN COP28, the Climate Governance Commission released a report titled "Governing Our Planetary Emergency," and they continue to advocate for updating our ideas on governance, specifically the idea that we need to move beyond nation states. And under this document, again, Governing Our Planetary Emergency, under a section titled Near-Term International Governance Innovations, it says that, quote, "We urge the UN General Assembly at the 2024 Summit of the Future to declare a planetary emergency, recognizing that the triple planetary crisis poses a grave risk to global stability and security, among others, to be reinforced in similar statements by bodies and agencies of the UN." They also echo the call for the emergency platform, which I told you about is in the zero draft version of the Pact for the Future. And they recommend convening a, quote, planetary emergency platform to address rapidly accelerating consequences of climate change. Now, look, my friends, here's a little history, conspiracy history, or just eugenics history, if you will. If you go back and you do the research, you start looking into groups like the Club of Rome. What you're going to find out is that these organizations are actually the originators of this idea of declaring a planetary emergency and this so-called polycrisis. Recently, the Climate Governance Commission put out a report, again, November 2023, that they said the belief in a polycrisis is, quote, recognized in the work of the Club of Rome Planetary Emergency Project. Well, let's look at that. The Planetary Emergency Project was established in 2019 when the Club of Rome published something called the Planetary Emergency Plan. And then they had updated it 1 year later, August 2020, at the very beginning of COVID-19 84. The Club of Rome's emergency plan is described as, quote, a roadmap for governments and other stakeholders to shift our societies and economies to bring back balance between people, planet, and prosperity. And again, the Club of Rome calls for a planetary emergency. They say the plan should, quote, be founded on the urgent need to at least have greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. These extreme calls for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, especially carbon, have led many researchers, including myself, to conclude that the guiding philosophy of the Club of Rome is actually a belief in eugenics masked by a faux environmental agenda. And I'm going to repeat some of the information I shared before. For those of you who are well versed in the Club of Rome, it'll be familiar. If not, this will be new to you. The Club of Rome was founded in 1968, and they actually played a major role in the development of the more well-known World Economic Forum. And on the 50th anniversary of the World Economic Forum, they actually looked back on their history, and they detailed how much of a role the Club of Rome played. They note that at their 1973 meeting, they had Aurelio Pesci, he's an Italian industrialist, my Italian's not great, who founded the Club of Rome with Alexander King, and they presented a speech on his now infamous book, The Limits to Growth. Alexander King was also responsible for a follow-up report which was released in 1991 titled The First Global Revolution. And it's this report that has a section titled The Common Enemy of Humanity is Man. And this is what it says. And again, I'll preface this by saying the Club of Rome claims that this following quote is taken out of context, and that they're not saying that we needed to conspire to make people convinced that humanity is the problem, but rather that they're just observing humanity is its own worst enemy. I'll let you decide. Again, the section is titled The Common Enemy of Humanity is Man from 1991 by the Club of Rome. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. In their totality and in their interactions, these phenomena do constitute a common threat which demands the solidarity of all peoples. But in designating them as the enemy, we fall into the trap about which we have already warned, namely mistaking symptoms for causes. All these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it is only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself. What do you guys think? I mean, it sounds pretty clear. They're saying, in searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, threat of global warming, would fit the bill. That sounds pretty plain to me, but you guys decide. So now let's wrap this up. What comes after the Summit of the Future? I'm not saying that on September 21st, this is all of a sudden we're going to end up in world government and the world's over or anything like that. I'm not spreading that fear porn, that doomsday porn. But this is absolutely a major step towards the creation of a world government. It will be one of many steps to come. In fact, in the recent, some of my recent investigations, I'm finding that the UN's already talking about 2025 meetings in 2026, because this is all building towards 2030. Remember that back in 2020, the United Nations and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation declared that this is the decade of transformation. They are trying to transform the world for this net zero agenda, for the carbon credits, and for all the things that we know, the technocratic state. And they're going to use fake pandemics or exaggerated pandemics or war or crises or whatever they want, including climate change, to implement that agenda. Carbon credits, for example, you go back and study the original technocracy movement, they talked about having energy credits and energy rations, but at that time, they didn't have the technology to implement this. Guess what we have now? Artificial intelligence, digital technology infrastructure. This can make the technocratic plan come to life. This is why we must resist it. This is why we must opt out. Now, I'm going to read to you guys the final part of the article. For those who know my writing style, I stick to the facts, but then if you make it all the way to the end, I try to make it a little more optimistic or inspiring. So this is what I wrote. One thing is clear: the Summit of the Future, the Pact for the Future, and the declaration of a planetary emergency needs more attention, and fast. Otherwise, the free-thinking people of the world will be in the same position that we have often found ourselves, looking back to the past with the benefit of hindsight, wishing that we had paid attention before it was too late to stop the advancement of the technocratic state. If we want to meaningfully challenge the Stimson Center, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Gates Foundation, the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, and the many other tentacles of this shadow government octopus, first, we must spread this knowledge as far and wide as possible, as quickly as we can. That means share this video, share my article when it comes out tomorrow, go to my website, go to TLab, find my previous reporting, share it with your friends and family, do your own content, do your own video breakdowns about it. With less than 60 days until the UN Summit of the Future and a potential declaration of a planetary emergency, we must do what we can to educate the public about this meeting and the danger that it poses to national sovereignty and thus individual sovereignty. And beyond educating the masses, we must also prepare for the potential that the Great Reset, Agenda 2030, and the fourth industrial revolution proposed by the UN and the WEF cabal will become a reality in some form or another. This is not to say that we ought to give up and cede our liberties to the technocrats. Rather, we should recognize that electoral politics and voting for presidential puppets will not lead to liberty in our lifetime or for future generations. Instead, we ought to put our energy into the creation of alternative, parallel systems which can compete with the technocratic state directly. And this is why I'm helping produce the People's Reset UK, our summit for the future, our summit for our future, which some of you may have heard me talking about recently. In fact, I was on Neil Oliver's show, Scottish broadcaster recently. Dan Aston Gregory, who I'm working with this, was on James Corbett's show this last week. We're getting the word out. And this summit for our future, the People's Reset, is happening the week after the UN's Summit for Our Future. So their summit is happening in New York City. The week after, we're meeting in Bath, UK, in person. If you can come, check it out. If not, it's going to be streamed for free online all over the world, like all of our events. And this is 3 days, 24 presenters focusing on solutions for creating parallel systems in the area of health, finance, education, digital technology, community building. There's a lot of different areas we're going to take that. And together, if we do that, if we focus our energy on these parallel alternative systems, I believe we actually can create a better world. But I don't think it's going to come. In fact, I know it's not going to come if we keep banging our head against the wall and playing the same old slave games and thinking that somehow we're going to beat these people through the political system, even though they created this very system to be corrupted in this exact way. So that is what the Summit of the Future is, my friends, and I encourage you to learn more about it. That article will be published at thelastamericanvagabond.com by tomorrow morning. For those of you who are seeing this later, it's probably up. And I'll just show you a couple other things on screen. These are things from the UN website that I pulled up. Press release: ahead of the Summit of the Future, countries commit to accelerate their delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. The high-level political forum, this just happened recently in New York. This, like I said, they just keep having more and more meetings. These people are so organized while we're sitting here arguing on the internet, trying to figure out who's a shill and who's a controlled opposition. These people put their differences aside and they work, they coordinate, they get shit done. This is another one on the Summit of the Future. Like I said, they're working on something called the Declaration on Future Generations. I'm going to be paying attention to this because, knowing these people, it's probably not good. And they've also got this one, the Global Digital Compact. They've also released the zero draft of that as well. So that is some more of what the heck is going on there with the crazy UN folks. And that is my report on the Summit of the Future. As I said, I really encourage you to check out the articles, to check out my previous videos I've done on this, to check out my interviews I've done with Jakob Nordengrad, who's from Sweden. He's one of the few other researchers working on this. I'll be interviewing him this coming week. And we're going to continue to try to expose this. I mean, I feel like this is what I have to dedicate my time to. We're 60 days away from the Summit of the Future. Some of us are even talking about trying to organize a counter protest or a counter rally during the Summit of the Future in New York City. I might fly out there. If any of you are interested in being involved in that, I don't think protesting alone is going to stop things. That's why the next weekend I'll be in Bath talking about parallel systems and building alternatives. But it is absolutely important that we get out there, that we hold a sign sometimes, that we go out and pass out flyers and talk to people and let people even know that these issues are going on and that the UN doesn't actually represent our values and our beliefs. And that ultimately the system that they are creating is not going to be one that leads to long-term liberty, long-term privacy for us or for future generations. So if we want to stop it, we need to educate people. We need to focus on getting out of their systems before it's too late. Because like I said, if the fourth industrial revolution, the Great Reset does happen, if we are not able of completely turning the tide and preventing it, then you want to make sure you're not stuck in their banking systems, or you're not stuck on digital identification systems. You're not stuck with facial recognition systems. You're not continuing to use big tech platforms, which are going to spy on you and steal all your data and things like that. There are things you can do. And this is what I talk about, again, in my book, How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State. Download it for free at theconsciousresistance.com/how-to. There's a free audiobook. It's available in Spanish, German, French, and of course, English and Korean very soon, Japanese as well, coming soon. I wrote this before COVID and I updated it with 5 new chapters after COVID, sharing everything I've learned, how I live my life without banks, how I don't have relationships with certain government agencies, and how I try to live free. I'm not saying I've achieved it all the way. I'm not saying it's easy. It's not easy. But if we care about our future privacy and liberty, and more importantly, we care about the coming generations, then we need to make some hard decisions. And that might involve changing your lifestyle, changing your habits, changing where you live, changing your relationships to make sure you are living in line with your values and principles. Otherwise, my friends, as I've continuously am harping on, you can be awake and still get marched right into the technocratic state, right into the FEMA camp. It's not enough to be awake anymore. We have to be activated. We have to be actively working on liberating ourselves from these systems. And as I mentioned, I am organizing the People's Reset. So this is a perfect time to take a quick break. I'm going to play you guys the brand new, we haven't even released this yet, 2-minute trailer describing the People's Reset. This will be posted on all the Conscious Resistance channels everywhere, and you can learn more. So we'll play that real quick, another quick promo break, and then we'll come back and we're going to talk about what I'm reading, what's on my bookshelf this week, which is this book. I'll tell you about it in a moment, and then we're going to wrap things up with a music video. So stay tuned. This is the trailer for the People's Reset UK, happening September 27th to the 29th in Bath, UK, and streaming for free online.
This is a solutions event. This is what's happening.
After 5 successful events in North America, the Freedom Cell Network is partnering with Free Humanity to bring the People's Reset to Bath, UK. In 2020, as the World Economic Forum announced the Great Reset Initiative, millions of people around the world began questioning the narratives being fed to them.
You must stay at home.
Millions of free-thinking people responded with protests, marches and rallies focused on waking up the rest of the world to the dark agenda of control and technocracy hidden beneath the so-called health initiatives.
We need to know every single piece of information.
We've lived that freedom message today, and we've been a walking symbol of what it means to be free.
While the world was reacting to the rapid expansion of tyranny, the Freedom Cell Network sought to promote solutions by launching the Greater Reset Activation in January 2021, a 5-day gathering designed to inspire, motivate, and activate freedom lovers into action. The Greater Reset highlighted the importance of localization, decentralization, individual and collective liberty, bodily autonomy, and freedom of choice.
The technocrats at the United Nations and the World Economic Forum are now hosting the Summit of the Future in New York City in September 2024.
At that meeting, governments of the world are expected to sign the so-called Pact for the Future. We reject their vision and the assumption that they speak for humanity. Join us in September for the People's Reset UK, our summit for our future.
Over 3 days, we will gather in community, celebrating our victories and successes, whilst continuing to highlight solutions under 5 holistic themes.
Liberate your mind, body, and spirit.
Permaculture and food independence.
Building parallel networks.
Empowering technology.
And building free and conscious communities. 24 top-notch speakers, including Neil Oliver, Charles Dowding, Dan Aston Gregory, Nigel Howlett, John and Rebecca Bush, and many more.
We'll also be hosting the People's Reset concert featuring international artist Dub FX, as well as Presence, 33, and more talented performers to come. Join us in Bath in September 2024 as we collaborate and build the parallel systems of the future.
Join us for the next evolution of the Greater Reset.
Join us for the People's Reset UK. Visit thegreaterreset.org to learn more and to get your ticket today.
So that is the People's Reset UK. The website is either you can go to thegreaterreset.org or thepeoplesreset.org and find out more. Again, in person, I highly encourage you. There's nothing like these experiences. I'm not saying this just because I organize this event. I've been organizing events on the local level and now on the international level for about 20 years. And people constantly tell us this is a life-changing experience, paradigm shifting. It's all solutions focused. None of the problems that you hear about on the internet all day. 5 holistic themes, as we said in the video: decentralized, grassroots, from the bottom up, not focused on the problems, but actually giving you practical solutions you can implement in your life. So I encourage you to check it out, thegreaterreset.org, thepeoplesreset.org, and you can learn more and come in person if you can. If not, watch it online, organize a watch party in your community, find a local cafe, open up your backyard, invite people, discuss permaculture, discuss getting off big tech, discuss growing your own food, discuss how to take care of your mind, body, and spirit. That's the real way, my friends. Not complaining online, not assuming that we're fucked because the World Economic Forum says we're going to own nothing and be miserable, but actually taking responsibility for your own lives and putting your lives in your hands.
Since 2012, the Conscious Resistance Network has been an independent media organization focused on empowering individuals through education, philosophy, health, and community organizing. We work to create a world where corporate and state power do not rule over the lives of free human beings. Our motto is leading by example and helping others in their pursuit of freedom. Visit theconsciousresistance.com to find our articles, documentaries, interviews, podcasts, books, and more. Remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free.